On this particular day, the 17th of September, the relief was slow and difficult. As 3-5 moved in and the men of 1/5 moved out, the Japanese in the ridges on our left front poured on the artillery and mortar fire. I pitied those tired men in 1-5 as they tried to extricate themselves without casualties. Their battalion, as with the others in the 5th Marines, had had a rough time crossing the airfield through the heavy fire the previous day. But once they got across, they met heavy resistance from pillboxes on the eastern side. We had been more fortunate. After getting across the airfield, 3-5 moved into the swamp, which wasn't defended as heavily. With the relief of 1-5 finally completed, we tied in with the 1st Marines on our left and 2-5 on our right. Our battalion was to attack during the afternoon through the low ground along the eastern side of Bloody Nose, while 2-5 was to clean out the jungle between our right flank and the eastern shore. As soon as we moved forward, we came under heavy flanking fire from Bloody Nose Ridge on our left. Snafu delivered his latest communiqué on the tactical situation to me as we hugged the deck for protection. "They need to get some more damn troops up here," he growled. Our artillery was called in, but our mortars could fire only to the front of the company and not on the left flank area, because that was in the area of the 1st Marines. The Japanese observers on the ridge had a clear, unobstructed view of us. Their artillery shells whined and shrieked, accompanied by the deadly whispering of the mortar shells. Enemy fire grew more intense until we were pinned down. We were getting the first bitter taste of Bloody Nose Ridge, and we had increasing compassion for the 1st Marines on our left, who were battering squarely into it. The Japanese ceased firing when our movement stopped. Yet as surely as 3 men grouped together or anyone started moving, enemy mortars opened up on us. If a general movement occurred, their artillery joined in. The Japanese began to demonstrate the excellent fire discipline that was to characterize their use of all weapons on Peleliu. They fired only when they could expect to inflict maximum casualties and stopped firing as soon as the opportunity passed. Thus, our observers and planes had difficulty finding their well-camouflaged positions in the ridges. When the enemy ceased firing artillery and mortars from caves, they shut protective steel doors and waited while our artillery, naval guns, and 81 mm mortars blasted away at the rock. If we moved ahead under our protective fire support, the Japanese pinned us down and inflicted serious losses on us, because it was almost impossible to dig a protective foxhole in the rock. No individual events of the attack stuck in my mind, just the severe fire from our left, and the feeling that any time the Japanese decided to do so, they could have blown us sky high. Our attack was called off late in the afternoon, and we were ordered to set up our mortar for the night. An NCO came by and told me to go with him and about 4 others from other platoons to unload an Amtrak bringing up supplies for Company K. We arrived at the designated place, dispersed a little so as not to draw fire, and waited for the Amtrak. In a few minutes it came clanking up in a swirl of white dust. "You guys from K Company, 5th Marines?" asked the driver. "Yeah, you got chow and ammo for us?" asked our NCO. "Yeah, sure have. Got a unit of fire, water and rations. Better get it unloaded as soon as you can or we'll draw fire," the driver said as his machine lurched to a halt and he climbed down. The tractor was an older model, such as I had landed from on D-Day. It didn't have a drop tailgate, so we climbed aboard and hefted the heavy ammo boxes over the side and down onto the deck. "Let's go, boys," our NCO said, as he and a couple of us climbed onto the tractor. I saw him gaze in amazement down into the cargo area of the tractor. At the bottom, wedged under a pile of ammo boxes, we saw one of those infernal 55-gallon oil drums of water. Filled, they weighed several hundred pounds. Our NCO rested his arms on the side of the tractor and remarked in an exasperated tone, "It took a bloody genius of a supply officer to do that. How in the hell are we supposed to get that drum out of there?" "I don't know," said the driver. "I just brought it up." We cursed and began unloading the ammo as fast as possible. We had expected the water to be in several 5-gallon cans, each of which weighed a little more than 40 pounds. We worked as rapidly as possible, But then we heard that inevitable and deadly whip shh, shh. 3 big mortar shells exploded, one after the other, not far from us. "Uh-oh, the stuff's hit the fan now," groaned one of my buddies. "Bear a hand, you guys. On the double," said our NCO. "Look, you guys, I'm going to have to get this tractor the hell out of here. If it gets knocked out and it's my fault, the lieutenant'll have my can in a crack," groaned the driver. We had no gripe with the driver, and we didn't blame him. The Amtrak drivers on Peleliu were praised by everyone for doing such a fine job. Their bravery and sense of responsibility were above question. We worked like beavers, as our NCO said to him, "I'm sorry, old buddy, but if we don't get these supplies unloaded, it's our ass." More mortar shells fell out to one side, and the fragments swished through the air. It was apparent that the Japanese mortar crew was trying to bracket us, but was afraid to fire too much for fear of being seen by our observers. We sweated and panted to get the ammo unloaded. We unloaded the water drum with a rope sling. "Do you need any help?" asked a Marine who appeared from the rear. We hadn't noticed him before he spoke. He wore green dungarees, leggings, and a cloth-covered helmet like ourselves, and carried a .45 caliber automatic pistol like any mortar gunner, machine gunner, or one of our officers. Of course, he wore no rank insignia, being in combat. What astonished us was that he looked to be more than 50 years old and wore glasses, a rarity. For example, only 2 men in Company K wore them. When he took off his helmet to mop his brow, we saw his grey hair. Most men forward of division and regimental CPs were in their late teens or early 20s. Many officers were in their mid-20s. When asked who he was and what unit he was in, he replied, "Captain Paul Douglas. I was division adjutant until that barrage hit the 5th Marines CP yesterday. Then I was assigned as R1 personnel officer in the 5th Regiment. I am very proud to be with the 5th Marines," he said. "Gosh, Captain, you don't have to be up here at all, do you?" asked one of our detail in disbelief as he passed ammo boxes to the fatherly officer. "No," Douglas said, "but I always want to know how you boys up here are making out and want to help if I can. What company are you fellows from?" "From K Company, sir," I answered. His face lit up and he said, "Ah, you're in Andy Haldane's company." We asked Douglas if he knew Ack. He said yes, that they were old friends. As we finished unloading, we all agreed that there wasn't a finer company commander than Captain Haldane. A couple more mortar shells crashed nearby. Our luck would run out soon. Japanese gunners usually got right on target. So we yelled, "Shove off," to the driver. He waved and clanked away in his unloaded Amtrak. Captain Douglas helped us stack some of the ammo and told us we had better disperse. I heard a buddy ask, "What's that crazy old grey-headed guy doing up here if he could be back at the regiment?" Our NCO growled, "Shut up! Knock it off, you 8-ball! He's trying to help knuckleheads like you, and he's a damned good man." Years after the war, I had the great pleasure of meeting and visiting with Senator Paul Douglas. I told him about the remark referring to him as the crazy old grey-headed guy. He laughed heartily and expressed great pride in having served with the 1st Marine Division. Each man in our detail took up a load of supplies, bade Captain Douglas so long, and started back to the company lines. Other men went back to bring up the rest of the supplies before dark. We ate chow and finished preparations for the night. That was the first night on Peleliu that I was able to make up a cup of hot bouillon from the dehydrated tablets in my K rations and a canteen cup of heated, polluted, oily water. Hot as the weather was, it was the most nourishing and refreshing food I had eaten in 3 days. The next day we got fresh water. It was a great relief after that polluted stuff. Dug in next to our gun pit were First Lieutenant Edward A. Hillbilly Jones, Company K's machine gun platoon leader, and a salty sergeant, John A. Teskovich. Things were quiet in our area except for our artillery's harassing fire pouring over. So after dark obscured us from Japanese observers, the 2 of them slipped over and sat at the edge of our gun pit. We shared rations and talked. The conversation turned out to be one of the most memorable of my life. Hillbilly was second only to Ak in popularity among the enlisted men in Company K. He was a clean-cut, handsome, light-complexioned man, not large, but well-built. Hillbilly told me he had been an enlisted man for several pre-war years, had gone to the Pacific with the company, and had been commissioned following Guadalcanal. He didn't say why he was made an officer, but the word among the men was that he had been outstanding on Guadalcanal. It was a widespread joke among men in the ranks during the war that an officer was made an officer and a gentleman by an act of Congress when he was commissioned. An act of Congress may have made Hillbilly an officer, but he was born a gentleman. No matter how filthy and dirty everyone was on the battlefield, Hillbilly's face always had a clean, fresh appearance. He was physically tough and hard, and obviously morally strong. He sweated as much as any man, but somehow seemed to stand above our foul and repulsive living conditions in the field. Hillbilly had a quiet and pleasant voice, even in command. His accent was soft, more that of the deep south, which was familiar to me, than that of the hill country. Between this man and all the Marines I knew, there existed a deep mutual respect and warm friendliness. He had that rare ability to be friendly, yet not familiar with enlisted men. He possessed a unique combination of those qualities of bravery, leadership, ability, integrity, dignity, straightforwardness, and compassion. The only other officer I ever knew who was his equal in all these qualities was Captain Haldane. That night, Hillbilly talked about his boyhood and his home in West Virginia. He asked me about mine. He also talked about his pre-war years in the Marine Corps. Later, I remembered little of what he said, but the quiet way he talked calmed me. He was optimistic about the battle in progress and seemed to understand and appreciate all my fears and apprehensions. I confided in him that many times I had been so terrified that I felt ashamed, and that some men didn't seem to be so afraid. He scoffed at my mention of being ashamed, and said that my fear had been no greater than anyone else's, but that I was just honest enough to admit its magnitude. He told me that he was afraid too, and that the first battle was the hardest, because a man didn't know what to expect. Fear dwelled in everyone, Hillbilly said. Courage meant overcoming fear and doing one's duty in the presence of danger, not being unafraid. The conversation with Hillbilly reassured me. When the sergeant came over and joined in after getting coffee, I felt almost light-hearted. As conversation trailed off, we sipped our joe in silence. Suddenly, I heard a loud voice say clearly and distinctly, "You will survive the war." I looked first at Hillbilly and then at the sergeant. Each returned my glance with a quizzical expression on his face in the gathering darkness. Obviously, they hadn't said anything. "Did y'all hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" they both inquired. "Someone said something," I said. "I didn't hear anything." "How about you?" said Hillbilly, turning to the sergeant. "No, just that machine gun off to the left." Shortly the word was passed to get settled for the night. Hillbilly and the sergeant crawled back to their hole as Snafu returned to the gun pit. Like most people, I had always been skeptical about people seeing visions and hearing voices. So I didn't mention my experience to anyone, but I believed God spoke to me that night on that Peleliu battlefield, and I resolved to make my life amount to something after the war. That night, the third since landing, as I settled back in the gun pit, I realized I needed a bath. In short, I stunk. My mouth felt, as the saying went, like I had gremlins walking around in it with muddy boots on. Short as it was, my hair was matted with dust and rifle oil. My scalp itches, and my stubble beard was becoming an increasing source of irritation in the heat. Drinking water was far too precious in those early days to use in brushing one's teeth or in shaving, even if the opportunity had arisen. The personal bodily filth imposed upon the combat infantryman by living conditions on the battlefield was difficult for me to tolerate. It bothered almost everyone I knew. Even the hardiest Marine typically kept his rifle and his person clean. His language and his mind might need a good bit of cleaning up, but not his weapon, his uniform, or his person. We had this philosophy drilled into us in boot camp, and many times at Camp Elliott I had to pass personal inspection, to the point of clean fingernails before being passed as fit to go on liberty. To be anything less than neat and sharp was considered a negative reflection on the Marine Corps and wasn't tolerated. It was tradition and folklore of the 1st Marine Division that the troops routinely referred to themselves when in the field as the raggedy-ass Marines. The emphasis during manoeuvres and field problems was on combat readiness. Once back in camp, however, no matter where in the boondocks it was situated, the troops cleaned up before anything else. In combat, cleanliness for the infantrymen was all but impossible. Our filth added to our general misery. Fear and filth went hand in hand. It has always puzzled me that this important factor in our daily lives has received so little attention from historians, and often is omitted from otherwise excellent personal memoirs by infantrymen. It is, of course, a vile subject, but it was as important to us then as being wet or dry, hot or cold, in the shade or exposed to the blistering sun, hungry, tired, or sick. Early the next morning, the 18th of September, our artillery and 81 mortars shelled Japanese positions to our front as we prepared to continue the previous day's attack northward on the eastern side of Bloody Nose Ridge. A typical pattern of attack in our company, or any other rifle company, went something like this. Our 2 mortars would fire on certain targets or areas known or thought to harbour the enemy. Our light machine gun squads fired on areas in front of the rifle platoons they were attached to support. Then 2 of the 3 rifle platoons moved out in dispersed order. The remaining platoon was held in company reserve. Just before the riflemen moved out, we ceased fire with the mortars. The machine guns stopped also, unless they were situated where they could fire over the heads of the advancing riflemen. The latter moved out at a walk to conserve energy. If they received enemy fire, they moved from place to place in short rushes. Thus they advanced until they reached the objective. The mortars stood by to fire if the riflemen ran into strong opposition, and the machine gun squads moved forward to add their fire support. The riflemen were the spearhead of any attack. Consequently, they caught more hell than anybody else. The machine gunners had a tough job because the Japanese concentrated on trying to knock them out. The flamethrower gunner had it rough, and so did the rocket launcher gunners and the demolition men. The 60 mortar men caught it from Japanese counter-battery fire of mortars and artillery, snipers, who were numerous, and bypassed Japanese machine guns, which were common. The tankers caught hell from mortar and artillery fire and mines. But it was always the riflemen who had the worst job. The rest of us only supported them. Marine Corps tactics called for bypassing single snipers or machine guns in order to keep forward momentum. Bypassed Japanese were knocked out by a platoon or company of infantry in reserve. Thus, mortars fired furiously on the enemy to the front while a small battle raged behind between bypassed, entrenched Japanese and Marines in reserve. These Japanese frequently fired from the rear, pinning down the advance and causing casualties. Troops had to be well disciplined to function this way, and leadership had to be the best to coordinate things under such chaotic conditions. Marine tactics resembled those developed by the Germans under General Erich Ludendorff, which proved so successful against the Allies in the spring of 1918. If the riflemen hit heavy opposition, our 81 mortars, artillery, tanks, ships and planes were called on for support. These tactics worked well on Peleliu until the Marines hit the mutually supporting complex of caves and pillboxes in the maze of coral ridges. As heavy casualties mounted, the reserve rifle platoon, mortarmen, company officers, and anybody else available acted as stretcher bearers to get the wounded out from under fire as fast as possible. Every man in Company K, no matter what his rank or job, did duty as a rifleman and stretcher bearer on numerous occasions on Peleliu and later on Okinawa. Shelling from the ridge positions on our left slowed us down. Our planes made airstrikes, and our ships and artillery attacked the ridges, but Japanese shells kept coming in. The company had an increasing number of casualties. We moved our mortar several times to avoid the shelling, but the Japanese artillery and mortar fire got so heavy and caused such losses to the battalion that our attack was finally called off about noon. On our right, 2 to 5 made better progress. That battalion moved forward through thick jungle shielded from enemy observers, then turned east and moved out onto the smaller prong of Peleliu's Lobster Claw. We moved behind 2 to 5 eastward across the Causeway Road to exploit their gain. Again shielded by thick woods, we moved away from Bloody Nose. We pitied the 1st Marines attacking the ridges. They were suffering heavy casualties. "The word is the 1st Marines catching hell," said Snafu. "Poor guys, I pity 'em," another man said. "Yeah, me too, but I hope like hell they take that damn ridge, and we don't have to go up there," said another. "That shelling coming from up there was hell, and you couldn't even locate the guns with field glasses," added someone else. From what we had seen thrown at us from the left flank during the past 2 days, and what I saw of the ridges then, I felt sure that sooner or later every battalion of every regiment in the division would get thrown against Bloody Nose. I was right. The 1st Marines' predicament at the time was worse than ours in 3 to 5. They were attacking the end of the ridge itself, and not only received heavy shelling from enemy caves there, but deadly accurate small arms fire as well. Being tied in with the 1st Marines at the time, we got the word straight from the troops themselves, and not from some overly optimistic officer in a CP putting pins on a map. The word passed along the line to us told that when the men of 2 over 1 moved up toward the Japanese positions following pre-assault artillery fire, the enemy fired on them from mutually supporting positions, pinning them down and inflicting heavy losses. If they managed to get onto the slopes, the Japanese opened fire point-blank from caves as soon as our artillery lifted. The enemy then moved back into their caves. If Marines got close enough to an enemy position to attack it with flamethrowers and demolition charges, Japanese in mutually supporting positions raked them with crossfire. Each slight gain by the 1st Marines on the ridges came at almost prohibitive cost in casualties. From what little we could see of the terrain, and from the great deal we heard first-hand of the desperate struggle on our left, some of us suspected that Bloody Nose was going to drag on and on in a long battle with many casualties. The troops got paid to do the fighting. I made $60 a month, and the High Command thought, but the big brass were predicting optimistically that the Japanese defences in the ridges would be breached any day, and Peleliu would be secured in a few days. As 3/5 moved eastward on the 18th of September, a buddy commented sadly, "You know, Sledgehammer, a guy from the 1st Marines told me they got them poor boys making frontal attacks with fixed bayonets on that damn ridge, and they can't even see the nips that are shooting at 'em. That poor kid was really depressed, don't see no way he can come out alive. There just ain't no sense in that. They can't get nowhere like that. It's slaughter." Yeah, some goddamn glory-happy officer wants another medal, I guess, and the guys get shot up for it. The officer gets the medal and goes back to the States, and he's a big hero. "Hero my ass. Getting troops slaughtered ain't being no hero," said a veteran bitterly. And bitterness it was. Even the most optimistic man I knew believed our battalion must take its turn against those incredible ridges, and dreaded it. As we moved toward the smaller Lobster Claw, Snafu chanted, "Oh, them mortar shells are busting up that old gang of mine," to the tune of "Those wedding bells are breaking up that old gang of mine." We halted frequently to rest briefly and to keep down the number of cases of heat prostration. Although not heavy, my pack felt like a steaming hot wet compress on my shoulders and upper back. We were sopping wet with sweat, and at night or during a halt in the shade our dungarees dried out a bit. When they did, heavy white lines of fine powdery salt formed, as though drawn by chalk, along the shoulders, waist, and so on. Later, as the campaign dragged on and our dungarees caked with coral dust, they felt like canvas instead of soft cotton. I carried a little Gideon's New Testament in my breast pocket, and it stayed soaked with sweat during the early days. The Japanese carried their personal photos and other papers in waterproof green rubber pocket-sized folding bags. I liberated one such bag from a corpse and used it as a covering for my New Testament. The little Bible went all the way through Okinawa's rains and mud with me, snug in its captured cover. During one halt along a sandy road in the woods, we heard the words "hot chow" passed. "The hell you say?" someone said in disbelief. "Straight dope? Pork chops?" We couldn't believe it, but it was true. We filed past a cylindrical metal container, and each of us received a hot, delicious pork chop. The chow had been sent ashore for Company K by the crew of LST 661. I vowed if the chance ever came, I would express my thanks to those sailors for that chow. As we sat along the road eating pork chops with our fingers, a friend sitting on his helmet next to me began to examine a Japanese pistol he had captured. Suddenly the pistol fired. He toppled over on his back, but sprang up immediately, holding his hand to his forehead. Several men hit the deck, and we all ducked at the sound of the shot. I had seen what happened, but ducked instinctively with an already well-developed conditioned reflex. I stood up and looked at the man's face. The bullet merely had creased his forehead. He was lucky. When the other men realized he wasn't hurt, they really began to kid him unmercifully. Typical comments went something like, "Hey, old buddy, I always knew you had a hard head, but I didn't know slugs would bounce off of it. You don't need a helmet except to sit on when we take 10. You're too young to handle dangerous weapons. Some people will do anything to get a Purple Heart. Is this the sort of thing you used to do to attract your mother's attention?" He rubbed his forehead, embarrassed, and mumbled, "Or knock it off." We moved along a causeway and finally halted on the edge of a swamp where the company deployed and dug in for the night. Things were fairly quiet. The next morning the company swung south, pushing through the heavy growth behind a mortar and artillery barrage. We killed a few Japanese throughout the area. Late in the day, Company K deployed again for the night. The following day, Company K received a mission to push a strong combat patrol to the east coast of the island. Our orders were to move through the thick growth onto the peninsula that formed the smaller Claw and set up a defensive position at the northern tip of the landmass on the edge of a mangrove swamp. Our orders didn't specify the number of days we were to remain there. First Lieutenant Hillbilly Jones commanded the patrol consisting of about 40 Marines plus a war dog, a Doberman Pinscher. Sergeant Henry, Hank, Boys was the senior NCO. As with all combat patrols, we were heavily armed with rifles and BRs. We also had a couple of machine gun squads and the mortar squad with us. Never missing an opportunity to get into the action with his cold steel, Sergeant Haney volunteered to go along. G2, Division Intelligence reports there are a couple thousand Japanese somewhere on the other side of that swamp, and if they try to move across it to get back to the defensive positions in Bloody Nose, we're to hold them up until artillery, airstrikes, and reinforcements can join us. A veteran NCO said in a terse voice, "Our mission was to make contact with the enemy, test his strength, or occupy and hold a strategic position against enemy attack. I wasn't enthusiastic about it. We picked up extra rations and ammunition as we filed through the company lines, exchanging parting remarks with friends. Heading into the thick scrub brush, I felt pretty lonesome, like a little boy going to spend his first night away from home. I realized that Company K had become my home. No matter how bad a situation was in the company, it was still home to me. It was not just a lettered company in a numbered battalion, in a numbered regiment, in a numbered division. It meant far more than that. It was home. It was my company. I belonged in it and nowhere else. Most Marines I knew felt the same way about their companies in whatever battalion, regiment, or Marine division they happened to be. This was the result of, or maybe a cause for, our strong esprit de corps. The Marine Corps wisely acknowledged this unit attachment. Men who recovered from wounds and returned to duty nearly always came home to their old company. This was not misplaced sentimentality, but a strong contributor to high morale. A man felt that he belonged to his unit and had a niche among buddies whom he knew and with whom he shared a mutual respect welded in combat. This sense of family was particularly important in the infantry, where survival and combat efficiency often hinged on how well men could depend on one another. We moved through the thick growth quietly in extended formation, with scouts out looking out for snipers. Things in our area were quiet, but the battle rumbled on Bloody Nose. Thick jungle growth clogged the swamp, which also contained numerous shallow tidal inlets and pools choked with mangroves, and bordered by more mangroves and low pandanus trees. If a plant were designed especially to trip a man carrying a heavy load, it would be a mangrove with its tangle of roots. I walked under a low tree that had a pair of man-o'-war birds nesting in its top. They showed no fear as they cocked their heads and looked down from their bulky stick nest. The male saw little of interest about me and began inflating his large red throat pouch to impress his mate. He slowly extended his huge 7-foot wingspan and clicked his long hooked beak. As a boy, I had seen similar man-o'-war birds sailing high over Gulf shores near Mobile, but never had I seen them this close. Several large white birds, similar to egrets, also perched nearby, but I couldn't identify them. My brief escape from reality ended abruptly when a buddy scolded in a low voice, "Sledgehammer, what the hell you staring at them birds for? You gonna get separated from the patrol?" as he motioned vigorously for me to hurry. He thought I'd lost my senses, and he was right. That was neither the time nor the place for something as utterly peaceful and ethereal as bird-watching, but I had had a few delightful and refreshing moments of fantasy and escape from the horror of human activities on Peleliu. We moved on and finally halted near an abandoned Japanese machine gun bunker built of coconut logs and coral rock. This bunker served as our patrol's CP. We deployed around it and dug in. The area was just a few feet above the water level, and the coral was fairly loose. We dug the mortar gun pit within a few feet of the swamp water, about 30 feet from the bunker. Visibility through the swamp was limited to a few feet by the dense tangle of mangrove roots on 3 sides of the patrol's defense perimeter. We didn't register in the gun, because we had to maintain absolute quiet at all times. If we made noise, we would lose the element of surprise should the Japanese try to come across the area. We simply aimed the mortar in the direction we would be most likely to fire. We ate our rations, checked our weapons, and prepared for a long night. We received the password as darkness settled on us, and a drizzling rain began. We felt isolated listening to moisture dripping from the trees and splashing softly into the swamp. It was the darkest night I ever saw. The overcast sky was as black as the dripping mangroves that walled us in. I had the sensation of being in a great black hole and reached out to touch the sides of the gun pit to orient myself. Slowly the reality of it all formed in my mind. We were expendable. It was difficult to accept. We come from a nation and a culture that values life and the individual. To find oneself in a situation where your life seems of little value is the ultimate in loneliness. It is a humbling experience. Most of the combat veterans had already grappled with this realization on Guadalcanal or Gloucester, but it struck me out in that swamp. George Sarrett, a Gloucester veteran, was in the gun pit with me, and we tried to cheer each other up. In low tones he talked of his boyhood in Texas and about Gloucester. Word came that Haney was crawling along checking positions. "What's the password?" whispered Haney as he crawled up to us. George and I both whispered the password. "Good," said Haney. "You guys be on the alert, you hear?" "Okay, Haney," we said. He crawled over to the CP, where I assumed he settled down. "I guess he'll be still for a while now," I said. "Hope the hell you're right," answered George. Well, I wasn't, because in less than an hour Haney made the rounds again. "What's the password?" he whispered as he poked his head up to the edge of our hole. We told him. "Good," he said. "You guys check your weapons. Got a round in the chamber?" he asked each of us. We answered yes. "Okay, stand by with that mortar. If the nips come through this swamp at high port with fixed bayonets, you'll need to fire he and flares as fast as you can." He crawled off. "Wish that Asiatic old boy would settle down. He makes me nervous. He acts like we are a bunch of green boots," my companion growled. George was a cool-headed, self-possessed veteran, and he spoke my sentiments. Haney was making me jittery too. Weary hours dragged on. We strained our eyes and ears in the dripping blackness for indications of enemy movement. We heard the usual jungle sounds caused by animals. A splash, as something fell into the water, made my heart pound and caused every muscle to tighten. Haney's inspection tours got worse. He obviously was getting more nervous with each hour. I wish to hell Hillbilly would grab him by the stacking swivel and anchor him in the CP, George mumbled. The luminous dial of my wristwatch showed the time was after midnight. In the CP, a low voice sounded, "Oh, ah, oh," and trailed off, only to repeat the sound louder. "What's that?" I asked George anxiously. "Sounds like some guy having a nightmare," he replied nervously. "They sure as hell better shut him up before every nip in this damned swamp knows our position." We heard someone moving and thrashing around in the CP. "Knock it off!" several men whispered near us. "Quiet that man down!" Hillbilly ordered in a stern, low voice. "Help! Help! Oh, God, help me!" shouted the wild voice. The poor Marine had cracked up completely. The stress of combat had finally shattered his mind. They were trying to calm him down, but he kept thrashing around. In a firm voice filled with compassion, Hillbilly was trying to reassure the man that he was going to be all right. The effort failed. Our comrade's tragically tortured mind had slipped over the brink. He screamed more loudly. Someone pinned the man's arms to his sides, and he screamed to the Doberman pinscher, "Help me, dog! The Japanese have got me! The Japanese have got me, and they're going to throw me in the ocean!" I heard the sickening crunch of a fist against a jaw as someone tried to knock the man unconscious. It didn't faze him. He fought like a wildcat, yelling and screaming at the top of his voice. Our corpsman then gave him an injection of morphine in the hope of sedating him. It had no effect. More morphine, it had no effect either. Veterans though they were, the men were all getting jittery over the noise they believed would announce our exact location to any enemy in the vicinity. "Hit him with the flat of that entrenching shovel!" a voice commanded in the CP. A horrid thud announced that the command was obeyed. The poor man finally became silent. "Christ Almighty, what a pity," said a Marine in a neighbouring foxhole. "You said that right, but if the goddamn nips don't know we're here, after all that yelling, they'll never know," his buddy said. A tense silence settled over the patrol. The horror of the whole affair stimulated Haney to check our positions frequently. He acted like some hyperactive demon and cautioned us endlessly to be on the alert. When welcome dawn finally came after a seemingly endless blackness, we all had frayed nerves. I walked the few paces over to the CP to find out what I could. The man was dead. Covered with his poncho, his body lay next to the bunker. The agony and distress etched on the strong faces of Hillbilly, Hank, and the others in the CP revealed the personal horror of the night. Several of these men had received or would receive decorations for bravery in combat, but I never saw such agonized expressions on their faces as that morning in the swamp. They had done what any of us would have had to do under similar circumstances. Cruel chance had thrust the deed upon them. Hillbilly looked at the radio man and said, "I'm taking this patrol in. Get battalion for me." The radio man tuned his big, pack-sized radio and got the battalion's CP. Hillbilly told the battalion's CO, Major Gustafson, that he wanted to bring in the patrol. We could hear the major tell Hillbilly he thought we should stay put for a couple of days until G2 could determine the disposition of the Japanese. Hillbilly, a first lieutenant, calmly disagreed, saying we hadn't fired a shot, but because of circumstances we all had a pretty bad case of nerves. He felt strongly that we should come in. I saw several old salts raise their eyebrows and smile as Hillbilly stated his opinion. To our relief, Gus agreed with him. I have always thought it was probably because of his respect for Hillbilly's judgment. "I'll send a relief column with a tank so you won't have any trouble coming in," said the major's voice. We all felt comforted. The word went rapidly through the patrol that we were going in. Everyone breathed easier. In about an hour we heard a tank coming. As it forced its way through the thick growth, we saw familiar faces of Company K men with it. We placed the body on the tank, and we returned to the company's lines. I never heard an official word about the death thereafter. Over the next few days, the 5th Marines patrolled most of the southern claw. We had set up defensive positions to prevent any possible counter-landing by the Japanese along the exposed southern beaches. On about the 25th of September, D+10, the battered 1st Marine Regiment was relieved by the U.S. Army's 321st Infantry Regiment of the 81st Infantry Division. The 1st Marines moved into our area where they were to await a ship to return them to Pavuvu. We picked up our gear and moved out from the relative quiet of the beach to board trucks that would speed our regiment to a position straddling the West Road. From there we would attack northward along the western side of the ridges. As we walked along one side of a narrow road, the 1st Marines filed along the other side to take over our area. I saw some familiar faces as the 3 decimated battalions trudged past us, but I was shocked at the absence of so many others whom I knew in that regiment. During the frequent halts typical to the movement of one unit into the position of another, we exchanged greetings with buddies and asked about the fate of mutual friends. We in the 5th Marines had many a dead or wounded friend to report about from our ranks, but the men in the 1st Marines had so many it was appalling. "How many men left in your company?" I asked an old Camp Elliott buddy in the 1st Marines. He looked at me wearily with bloodshot eyes and choked as he said, "20 is all that's left in the whole company, Sledgehammer. They nearly wiped us out. I'm the only one left out of the old bunch in my company that was with us in mortar school at Elliott." I could only shake my head and bite my lip to keep from getting choked up. "See you on Pavuvu," I said. "Good luck," he said in a dull, resigned tone that sounded as though he thought I might not make it. What once had been companies in the 1st Marines looked like platoons. Platoons looked like squads. I saw few officers. I couldn't help wondering if the same fate awaited the 5th Marines on those dreadful ridges. 20 bloody, gruelling, terrible days and nights later, on the 15th of October, D+30, my regiment would be relieved. Its ranks would be just about as decimated as those we were filing past. We boarded trucks that carried us southward along the East Road, then some distance northward along the West Road. As we bumped and jolted past the airfield, we were amazed at all the work the Seabees, naval construction battalions, had accomplished on the field. Heavy construction equipment was everywhere, and we saw hundreds of service troops living in tents and going about their duties as though they were in Hawaii or Australia. Several groups of men, Army and Marine service troops, watched our dusty truck convoy go by. They wore neat caps and dungarees, were clean-shaven, and seemed relaxed. They eyed us curiously, as though we were wild animals in a circus parade. I looked at my buddies in the truck and saw why. The contrast between us and the onlookers was striking. We were armed, helmeted, unshaven, filthy, tired, and haggard. The sight of clean, comfortable non-combatants was depressing, and we tried to keep up our morale by discussing the show of US material power and technology we saw. We got off the trucks somewhere up the West Road, parallel to the section of the ridges on our right that was in American hands. We heard firing on the closest ridge. The troops I saw along the road as we unloaded were Army infantrymen from the 321st Infantry Regiment, veterans of Angkor. As I exchanged a few remarks with some of these men, I felt a deep comradeship and respect for them. Reporters and historians like to write about inter-service rivalry among military men. It certainly exists, but I found that frontline combatants in all branches of the services showed a sincere mutual respect when they faced the same danger and misery. Combat soldiers and sailors might call us gyrenes, and we called them dog-faces and swabbies, but we respected each other completely. After the relief of 1st Marines, a new phase of the fight for Peleliu began. No longer would the Marines suffer prohibitive casualties in fruitless frontal assaults from the south against the ridges. Rather, they would sweep up the western coast around the enemy's last-ditch defences in search of a better route into the final pocket of resistance. Although the bitter battle for Peleliu would drag on for another 2 months, the 1st Marine Division seized all of the terrain of strategic value in the first week of bitter fighting. In a series of exhausting assaults, the division had taken the vital airfield, the commanding terrain above it, and all of the island south and east of Umabrogel Mountain. Yet the cost had been high, 3,946 casualties. The division had lost one regiment as an effective fighting unit and had severely depleted the strength of its other two. Historical accounts of battles often leave a reader with the impression that the individual participants had a panoramic view of events. Such is not the case, however. Even the historians have never been able to piece together completely what happened to 3-5 on D-Day at Peleliu. Schaffner had assumed command of 3-5 before the Peleliu campaign. Not only was he highly respected, but his men considered him someone special. As a captain, he had survived the fighting on Corregidor, been captured by the Japanese, escaped, and had returned to combat. He came back to the division later and commanded the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines on Okinawa. He retired from the Corps as a brigadier general. Walt was the executive officer of the 5th Marines when the battle for Peleliu began. He remained with 3-5 for a few days as its commanding officer until a replacement was named. A combat Marine in the truest sense, Walt had served with the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal and at Cape Gloucester. He had won the Navy Cross for heroism. He went on to serve in the Korean War and later in Vietnam, where, as a lieutenant general, he commanded the 3 Marine Amphibious Corps for nearly 2 years. He retired as a general after serving as assistant commandant of the Marine Corps. Casualty figures for the 1st Marine Division on D-Day reflected the severity of the fighting and the ferocity of the Japanese defence. The division staff had predicted D-Day losses of 500 casualties, but the total figure was 1,111 killed and wounded, not including heat prostration cases. The Shore Party Battalion consisted of Marines assigned the mission of unloading and handling supplies and of directing logistics traffic on the beach during an amphibious assault. Determined from experience, a unit of fire was the amount of ammunition that would last, on average, for 1 day of heavy fighting. A unit of fire for the M1 rifle was 100 rounds, for the carbine 45 rounds, for the .45 caliber pistol 14 rounds, for the light machine gun 1,500 rounds, and for the 60 mm mortar 100 rounds. Paul Douglas became a legend in the 1st Marine Division. This remarkable man was 53 years old, had been an economics professor at the University of Chicago, and had enlisted in the Marine Corps as a private. In the Peleliu battle, he was slightly wounded carrying flamethrower ammunition up to the lines. At Okinawa, he was wounded seriously by a bullet in the arm while carrying wounded for 3-5. Even after months of therapy, he didn't regain complete use of the limb. Both Hillbilly and Teskovich were later killed. For nearly a week of bitter combat, Major General William H. Rupertus insisted that the 1st Marine Division could handle the job on Peleliu alone. Only after the 1st Marine Regiment was ground down to a nub, suffering 56% casualties, did Major General Roy Geiger, commander of the 3rd Marine Amphibious Corps, overrule Rupertus and order in the U.S. Army's 321st Infantry Regiment to help the Marines. I fulfilled that vow in July 1945 after the battle for Okinawa ended. The 5th Marines now had the mission to secure the northern part of the island, that is, the upper part of the larger Lobster Claw. Following that chore, the regiment was to move south again on the eastern side of the Umabrogol ridges to complete the isolation and encirclement. Most of us in the ranks never saw a map of Peleliu except during training on Pavuvu, and had never heard the ridge system referred to by its correct name, Umabrogol Mountain. We usually referred to the whole ridge system as Bloody Nose Ridge, or simply the ridges. As we moved through the army lines, Japanese machine guns were raking the crest of the ridge on our right. The slugs and bluish-white tracers pinned down the American troops on the ridge, but passed high above us on the road. The terrain was flat and sparsely wooded. Tanks supported us, and we were fired on by small arms, artillery and mortars from the high coral ridges to our right, and from Ngesibus Island a few hundred yards north of Peleliu. Our battalion turned right at the junction of West Road and East Road, headed south along the latter, and stopped at dusk. As usual, there wasn't much digging in as such, mostly finding some crater or depression and piling rocks around it for what protection we could get. I was ordered to carry a 5-gallon can of water over to the company CP. When I got there, Ak was studying a map by the light of a tiny flashlight that his runner shielded with another folded map. The company's radio man was sitting with him, quietly tuning his radio and calling an artillery battery of the 11th Marines. Putting the water can down, I sat on it and watched my skipper with admiration. Never before had I regretted so profoundly my lack of artistic talent and inability to draw the scene before me. The tiny flashlight faintly illuminated Captain Haldane's face as he studied the map. His big jaw, covered with a charcoal stubble of beard, jutted out, his heavy brow wrinkled with concentration just below the rim of his helmet. The radio man handed the phone to Ak. He requested a certain number of rounds of 75 HE to be fired out to Company K's front. A Marine on the other end of the radio questioned the need for the request. Haldane answered pleasantly and firmly, "Maybe so, but I want my boys to feel secure." Shortly the 75S came whining overhead and started bursting in the dark, thick growth across the road. Next day I told several men what Ak had said. "That's the skipper for you, always thinking of the troops' feelings," was the way one man summed it up. Several hours passed. It was my turn to be on watch in our hole. Snafu slept fitfully and ground his teeth audibly, which he usually did during sleep in combat. The white coral road shone brightly in the pale moonlight as I strained my eyes looking across into the wall of dark growth on the other side. Suddenly 2 figures sprang up from a shallow ditch directly across the road from me. With arms waving wildly, yelling and babbling hoarsely in Japanese, they came. My heart skipped a beat, then began pounding like a drum as I flipped off the safety of my carbine. One enemy soldier angled to my right, raced down the road a short distance, crossed over, and disappeared into a foxhole in the line of the company on our right flank. I focused on the other. Swinging a bayonet over his head, he headed at me. I dared not fire at him yet, because directly between us was a foxhole with 2 Marines in it. If I fired just as the Marine on watch rose up to meet the Japanese intruder, my bullet would surely hit a comrade in the back. The thought flashed through my mind. Why doesn't Sam or Bill fire at him? With a wild yell, the Japanese jumped into the hole with the 2 Marines. A frantic, desperate hand-to-hand struggle ensued, accompanied by the most gruesome combination of curses, wild babbling, animalistic guttural noises, and grunts. Sounds of men hitting each other and thrashing around came from the foxhole. I saw a figure pop out of the hole and run a few steps toward the CP. In the pale moonlight, I then saw a Marine nearest the running man jump up. Holding his rifle by the muzzle and swinging it like a baseball bat, he blasted the infiltrator with a smashing blow. From our right, where the Japanese had gone into the company on our flank, came hideous, agonized, and prolonged screams that defied description. Those wild, primitive, brutish yellings unnerved me more than what was happening within my own field of vision. Finally, a rifle shot rang out from the foxhole in front of me, and I heard Sam say, "I got him!" The figure that had been clubbed by the rifle lay groaning on the deck about 20 feet to the left of my hole. The yelling over to our right ceased abruptly. By this time, of course, everyone was on the alert. "How many nips were there?" asked a sergeant near me. "I saw 2, I answered. "There must have been more," someone else put in. "No," I insisted. "Only 2 came across the road here. One of them ran to the right where all that yelling was, and the other jumped into the hole where Sam shot him." "Well then, if there were just those 2 nips, what's all that groaning over here then?" he asked, indicating the man felled by the rifle butt. "I don't know, but I didn't see but 2 nips, and I'm sure of it," I said adamantly, with an insistence that has given me peace of mind ever since. A man in a nearby hole said, "I'll check it out." Everyone sat still as he crawled to the groaning man in the shadows. A .45 pistol shot rang out. The moaning stopped, and the Marine returned to his hole. A few hours later, as objects around me became faintly visible with the dawn, I noticed that the still form lying to my left didn't appear Japanese. It was either an enemy in Marine dungarees and leggings, or it was a Marine. I went over to find out which. Before I got to the prone body, its identity was obvious to me. "My God!" I said in horror. Several men looked at me and asked what was the matter. "It's Bill," I said. An officer and an NCO came over from the CP. "Did he get shot by one of those Japanese?" asked the sergeant. I didn't answer, just looked at him with a blank stare and felt sick. I looked at the man who had crawled past me to check on the groaning man in the dark. He had shot Bill through the temple, mistakenly assuming him to be a Japanese. Bill hadn't told any of us he was leaving his foxhole. As the realization of his fatal mistake hit him, the man's face turned ashen, his jaw trembled, and he looked as though he were going to cry. Man that he was, though, he went straight over and reported to the CP. Ak sent for and questioned several men who were dug in nearby, including myself, to ascertain exactly what had happened. Ak was seated off to himself. "At ease, Sledge," he said. "Do you know what happened last night?" I told him I had a pretty good idea. "Tell me exactly what you saw." I told him, making clear I had seen 2, and only 2 Japanese, and had said so at the time. I also told him where I saw those enemy soldiers go. "Do you know who killed Bill?" the captain asked. "Yes," I said. Then he told me it had been a tragic mistake that anyone could have made under the circumstances, and never to discuss it or mention the man's name. He dismissed me. As far as the men were concerned, the villain in the tragedy was Sam. At the time of the incident, Sam was supposed to be on watch while Bill was taking his turn at getting much-needed sleep. It was routine that at a pre-agreed time, the man on watch woke his buddy and, after reporting anything he had seen or heard, took his turn at sleep. This standard procedure in combat on the front line was based on a fundamental creed of faith and trust. You could depend on your buddy, he could depend on you. It extended beyond your foxhole too. We felt secure, knowing that one man in each hole was on watch through the night. Sam had betrayed that basic trust and had committed an unforgivable breach of faith. He went to sleep on watch while on the line. As a result, his buddy died, and another man would bear the heavy burden of knowing that, accident though it was, he had pulled the trigger. Sam admitted that he might have dozed off. The men were extremely hard on him for what had happened. He was visibly remorseful, but it made no difference to the others who openly blamed him. He whined and said he was too tired to stay awake on watch, but he only got sworn at by men who were equally tired yet reliable. We all liked Bill a great deal. He was a nice young guy, probably in his teens. On the neatly typewritten muster roll for the 3D Battalion, 5th Marines on the 25th of September 1944, one reads these stark words. ______________________ William S., killed in action against the enemy, wound, gunshot, head, remains interred in grave hash 3/M. So simply stated, such an economy of words. But to someone who was there, they convey a tragic story. What a waste. The Japanese who had come across the road in front of me were probably members of what the enemy called a close-quarter combat unit. The enemy soldier shot by Sam was not dressed or equipped like their typical infantryman. Rather, he wore only tropical khaki shorts, short-sleeved shirt, and tabby footwear, split-toed, rubber-soled canvas shoes. He carried only his bayonet. Why he entered our line where he did may have been pure accident, or he may have had an eye on our mortar. His comrade angled off toward the right near a machine gun on our flank. Mortars and machine guns were favourite targets for infiltrators on the front lines. To the rear, they went after heavy mortars, communications, and artillery. Before Company K moved out, I went down the road to the next company to see what had happened during the night. I learned that those blood-chilling screams had come from the Japanese I had seen run to the right. He had jumped into a foxhole where he met an alert Marine. In the ensuing struggle, each had lost his weapon. The desperate Marine had jammed his forefinger into his enemy's eye socket and killed him. Such was the physical horror and brutish reality of war for us. Early the next morning, our battalion made a successful assault on a small hill on the narrow neck of northern Peleliu. Because of its isolated position, it lacked the mutual support from surrounding caves that made most of the ridges on the island impregnable. At this time, the rest of the regiment was getting a lot of enemy fire from Ngesabus Island. The word was that several days earlier the Japanese had slipped reinforcements by barge down to Peleliu from the larger islands to the north. Some of the barges had been shot up and sunk by the navy, but several hundred enemy troops got ashore. It was a real blow to our morale to hear this. "Sounds just like Guadalcanal," said a veteran. "About the time we think we got the bastards boxed in, the damn nips bring in reinforcements, and it'll go on and on." "Yeah," said another, "and once these slant-eyed bastards get in these caves around here, it'll be hell to pay." On the 27th of September, army troops took over our positions. We moved northward. "Our battalion is ordered to hit the beach on Ngesabus Island tomorrow," an officer told us. I shuddered as I recalled the beachhead we had made on the 15th of September. The battalion moved into an area near the northern peninsula and dug in for the night in a quiet area. It was sandy, open, and had some shattered, drooping palms. We didn't know what to expect on Ngesabus. I prayed the landing wouldn't be a repeat of the Holocaust of D-Day. Early in the morning of the 28th of September, D+3, we squared away our gear and stood by to board the Amtraks that would take us across the 700 yards of shallow reef to Ngesabus. "We'll probably get another battle star for this beachhead," said a man enthusiastically. "No, we won't," answered another. "It's still just part of the Peleliu operation." "The hell you say? It's still another beachhead," the first man responded. "I don't make the regulation, old buddy, but you check with the gunny, and I'll betcha I'm right." Several mumbled comments came out about how stingy the High Command was in authorizing battle stars, which were little enough compensation for combat duty. We boarded the tractors and tried to suppress our fear. Ships were firing on Ngesabus, and we saw Marine F-4U Corsair fighter planes approaching from the Peleliu airfield to the south. "We're going to have lots of support for this one," an NCO said. Our Amtraks moved to the water's edge and waited for H-hour as the thunderous pre-landing naval gunfire bombardment covered the little island in smoke, flame and dust. The Corsairs from Marine Fighter Squadron, VMF, 114 peeled off and began bombing and strafing the beach. The engines of the beautiful blue gull-winged planes roared, whined and strained as they dove and pulled out. They plastered the beach with machine guns, bombs and rockets. The effect was awesome as dirt, sand and debris spewed into the air. Our marine pilots outdid themselves, and we cheered, yelled, waved, and raised our clenched fists to indicate our approval. Never during the war did I see fighter pilots take such risks by not pulling out of their dives until the very last instant. We were certain, more than once, that a pilot was pulling out too late and would crash. But expert flyers that they were, they gave that beach a brutal pounding without mishap to plane or pilot. We talked about their spectacular flying even after the war ended. Out to sea on our left, with a cruiser, destroyers and other ships firing support, was a huge battleship. Someone said it was the USS Mississippi, but I never knew for sure. She ranked with the Corsairs in the massive destruction she hurled at Ngesabus. The huge shells rumbled like freight cars, as the men always used to describe the sound of projectiles from full-sized battleships' 16-inch guns. At H-hour, our tractor driver revved up his engine. We moved into the water and started the assault. My heart pounded in my throat. Would my luck hold out? "The Lord is my shepherd," I prayed quietly and squeezed my carbine stock. To our relief, we received no fire as we approached the island. When my Amtrak lurched to a stop well up on the beach, the tailgate went down with a bump and we scrambled out. With its usual din and thunder, the bombardment moved inland ahead of us. Some Company K Marines on the beach were already firing into pillboxes and bunkers and dropping in grenades. With several other men, I headed inland a short distance, but as we got to the edge of the airstrip, we had to dive for cover. A Nambu, Japanese light machine gun, had cut loose on us. A buddy and I huddled behind a coral rock as the machine gun slugs zipped viciously overhead. He was on my right. Because the rock was small, we pressed shoulder to shoulder, hugging it for protection. Suddenly there was a sickening crack, like someone snapping a large stick. My friend screamed, "Oh God, I'm hit!" and lurched over onto his right side. He grabbed his left elbow with his right hand, groaning and grimacing with pain as he thrashed around, kicking up dust. A bypassed sniper had seen us behind the rock and shot him. The bullet hit him in the left arm, which was pressed tightly against my right arm as we sought cover from the machine gun out front. The Nambu was firing a bit high, but there was no doubt the sniper had his sights right on us. We were between a rock and a hard place. I dragged him around the rock out of sight of the sniper as the Nambu bullets whizzed overhead. I yelled, "Corpsman!" and Ken, Doc. Caswell, the mortar section corpsman, crawled over, opening his pouch to get at his first aid supplies as he came. Another man also came over to see if he could help. While I cut away the bloody dungaree sleeve from the injured arm with my kabar, Doc began to tend the wound. As he knelt over his patient, the other Marine placed his kabar under the injured man's pack strap and gave a violent upward jerk to cut away the shoulder pack. The razor-sharp blade sliced through the thick web pack strap as though it were a piece of string. But before the Marine could arrest its upward motion, the knife cut Doc in the face to the bone. Doc recoiled in pain from the impact of the knife thrust. Blood flowed down his face from the nasty gash to the left of his nose. He regained his balance immediately and returned to his work on the smashed arm as though nothing had happened. The clumsy Marine cursed himself for his blunder as I asked Doc what I could do to help him. Despite considerable pain, Doc kept at his work. In a quiet, calm voice, he told me to get a battle dressing out of his pouch and press it firmly against his face to stop the bleeding while he finished work on the wounded arm. Such was the selfless dedication of the Navy hospital corpsmen who served in Marine infantry units. It was little wonder that we held them in such high esteem. Doc later got his face tended and was back with the mortar section in a matter of a few hours. While I did as Doc directed, I yelled at two Marines coming our way and pointed toward the sniper. They took off quickly toward the beach and hailed a tank. By the time a stretcher team came up and took my wounded friend, the two men trotted by, waved, and one said, "We got the bastard. He ain't going to shoot nobody else." The Nambu had ceased firing, and an NCO signalled us forward. Before moving out, I looked toward the beach and saw the walking wounded wading back toward Peleliu. After we moved farther inland, we received orders to set up the mortars on the inland side of a Japanese pillbox and prepare to fire on the enemy to our company's front. We asked Company K's gunnery sergeant, G.Y. Sergeant W.R. Saunders, if he knew of any enemy troops in the bunker. It appeared undamaged. He said some of the men had thrown grenades through the ventilators, and he was sure there were no live enemy inside. Snafu and I began to set up our mortar about 5 feet from the bunker. Number 1 mortar was about 5 yards to our left. Seapalo R.V. Bergin was getting the sound-powered phone hooked up to receive fire orders from Sergeant Johnny Marmot, who was observing. I heard something behind me in the pillbox. The Japanese were talking in low, excited voices. Metal rattled against an iron grating. I grabbed my carbine and yelled, "Bergin, there are nips in that pillbox!" All the men readied their weapons as Bergin came over to have a look, kidding me with, "Shucks, Sledgehammer, you're cracking up." He looked into the ventilator port directly behind me. It was rather small, approximately 6 inches by 8 inches, and covered with iron bars about a ½ inch apart. What he saw brought forth a stream of curses in his best Texas style against all Nippon. He stuck his carbine muzzle through the bars, fired 2 quick shots, and yelled, "I got 'em right in the face!" The Japanese inside the pillbox began jabbering loudly. Bergin was gritting his teeth and calling the enemy SOBs while he fired more shots through the opening. Every man in the mortar section was ready for trouble as soon as Bergin fired the first shot. It came in the form of a grenade tossed out of the end entrance to my left. It looked as big as a football to me. I yelled, "Grenade!" and dove behind the sand breastwork protecting the entrance at the end of the pillbox. The sandbank was about 4 feet high and L-shaped to protect the entrance from fire from the front and flanks. The grenade exploded, but no one was hit. The Japanese tossed out several more grenades without causing us injury because we were hugging the deck. Most of the men crawled around to the front of the pillbox and crouched close to it between the firing ports so the enemy inside couldn't fire at them. John Redifer and Vincent Santos jumped on top. Things got quiet. I was nearest the door, and Bergin yelled to me, "Look in and see what's in there, Sledgehammer!" Being trained to take orders without question, I raised my head above the sandbank and peered into the door of the bunker. It nearly cost me my life. Not more than 6 feet from me crouched a Japanese machine gunner. His eyes were black dots in a tan, impassive face topped with the familiar mushroom helmet. The muzzle of his light machine gun stared at me like a gigantic third eye. Fortunately for me, I reacted first. Not having time to get my carbine into firing position, I jerked my head down so fast my helmet almost flew off. A split second later, he fired a burst of 6 or 8 rounds. The bullets tore a furrow through the bank just above my head and showered sand on me. My ears rang from the muzzle blast and my heart seemed to be in my throat, choking me. I knew damned well I had to be dead. He just couldn't have missed me at that range. A million thoughts raced through my terrified mind. Of how my folks had nearly lost their youngest, of what a stupid thing I had done to look directly into a pillbox full of Japanese without even having my carbine at the ready, and of just how much I hated the enemy anyway. Many a Marine veteran had already lost his life on Peleliu for making less of a mistake than I had just made. Bergin yelled and asked if I were all right. A hoarse squawk was all the answer I could muster, but his voice brought me to my senses. I crawled around to the front, then up on top of the bunker before the enemy machine gunner could have another try at me. Redifer yelled, "They've got an automatic weapon in there." Snafu disagreed, and a spirited argument ensued. Redifer pointed out that there surely was an automatic weapon in there, and that I should know, because it came close to blowing off my head. But Snafu was adamant. Like much of what I experienced in combat, this exchange was unreal. Here we were, 12 Marines with a bull by the tail in the form of a well-built concrete pillbox containing an unknown number of Japanese with no friendly troops near us, and Snafu and Redifer, veterans, in a violent argument. Bergin shouted, "Knock it off," and they shut up. Redifer and I lay prone on top of the bunker, just above the door. We knew we had to get the Japanese while they were bottled up, or they would come out at us with knives and bayonets, a thought none of us relished. Redifer and I were close enough to the door to place grenades down the opening and move back before they exploded. But the Japanese invariably tossed them back at us before the explosion. I had an irrepressible urge to do just that. Brief as our face-to-face meeting had been, I had quickly developed a feeling of strong personal hate for that machine gunner who had nearly blasted my head off my shoulders. My terror subsided into a cold, homicidal rage and a vengeful desire to get even. Redifer and I gingerly peeped down over the door. The machine gunner wasn't visible, but we looked at 3 long Arisaka rifle barrels with bayonets fixed. Those bayonets seemed 10 feet long to me. Their owners were jabbering excitedly, apparently planning to rush out. Redifer acted quickly. He held his carbine by the barrel and used the butt to knock down the rifles. The Japanese jerked their weapons back into the bunker with much chattering. Behind us, Santos yelled that he had located a ventilator pipe without a cover. He began dropping grenades into it. Each one exploded in the pillbox beneath us with a muffled bam. When he had used all of his, Redifer and I handed him our grenades while we kept watch at the door. After Santos had dropped in several, we stood up and began to discuss with Bergin and the others the possibility that anyone could still be alive inside. We didn't know at the time that the inside was subdivided by concrete baffles for extra protection. We got our answer when 2 grenades were tossed out. Luckily for the men with Bergin, the grenades were thrown out the back. Santos and I shouted a warning and hit the deck on the sand on top of the pillbox, but Redifer merely raised his arm over his face. He took several fragments in the forearm, but wasn't seriously wounded. Bergin yelled, Let's get the hell out of here and get a tank to help us knock this damn thing out. He ordered us to pull back to some craters about 40 yards from the pillbox. We sent a runner to the beach to bring up a flamethrower and an Amtrak armed with a 75mm gun. As we jumped into the crater, 3 Japanese soldiers ran out of the pillbox door past the sandbank and headed for a thicket. Each carried his bayoneted rifle in his right hand and held up his pants with his left hand. This action so amazed me that I stared in disbelief and didn't fire my carbine. I wasn't afraid, as I had been under shell fire, just filled with wild excitement. My buddies were more effective than I, and cut down the enemy with a hail of bullets. They congratulated each other, while I chid myself for being more curious about strange Japanese customs than with being combat effective. The Amtrak rattling toward us by this time was certainly a welcome sight. As it pulled into position, several more Japanese raced from the pillbox in a tight group. Some held their bayoneted rifles in both hands, but some of them carried their rifles in one hand and held up their pants with the other. I had overcome my initial surprise and joined the others and the Amtrak machine gun in firing away at them. They tumbled onto the hot coral in a forlorn tangle of bare legs, falling rifles and rolling helmets. We felt no pity for them, but exulted over their fate. We had been shot at and shelled too much, and had lost too many friends to have compassion for the enemy when we had him cornered. The Amtrak took up a position on a line even with us. Its commander, a sergeant, consulted Bergin. Then the turret gunner fired 3 armor-piercing 75mm shells at the side of the pillbox. Each time our ears rang with the familiar wham-bam, as the report of the gun was followed quickly by the explosion of the shell on a target at close range. The third shell tore a hole entirely through the pillbox. Fragments kicked up dust around our abandoned packs and mortars on the other side. On the side nearest us, the hole was about 4 feet in diameter. Bergin yelled to the tankers to cease firing lest our equipment be damaged. Someone remarked that if fragments hadn't killed those inside, the concussion surely had. But even before the dust settled, I saw a Japanese soldier appear at the blasted opening. He was grim determination personified as he drew back his arm to throw a grenade at us. My carbine was already up. When he appeared, I lined up my sights on his chest and began squeezing off shots. As the first bullet hit him, his face contorted in agony. His knees buckled. The grenade slipped from his grasp. All the men near me, including the Amtrak machine gunner, had seen him and began firing. The soldier collapsed in the fusillade, and the grenade went off at his feet. Even in the midst of these fast-moving events, I looked down at my carbine with sober reflection. I had just killed a man at close range. That I had seen clearly the pain on his face when my bullets hit him came as a jolt. It suddenly made the war a very personal affair. The expression on that man's face filled me with shame and then disgust for the war and all the misery it was causing. My combat experience thus far made me realize that such sentiments for an enemy soldier were the maudlin meditations of a fool. Look at me, a member of the 5th Marine Regiment, one of the oldest, finest and toughest regiments in the Marine Corps, feeling ashamed because I had shot a damned foe before he could throw a grenade at me. I felt like a fool and was thankful my buddies couldn't read my thoughts. Bergin's order to us to continue firing into the opening interrupted my musings. We kept up a steady fire into the pillbox to keep the Japanese pinned down while the flamethrower came up, carried by Corporal Womack from Mississippi. He was a brave, good-natured guy and popular with the troops, but he was one of the fiercest-looking Marines I ever saw. He was big and husky, with a fiery red beard well powdered with white coral dust. He reminded me of some wild Viking. I was glad we were on the same side. Stooped under the heavy tanks on his back, Womack approached the pillbox with his assistant just out of the line of our fire. When they got about 15 yards from the target, we ceased firing. The assistant reached up and turned a valve on the flamethrower. Womack then aimed the nozzle at the opening made by the 75mm gun. He pressed the trigger. With a "ooh," the flame leaped at the opening. Some muffled screams, then all quiet. Even the stoic Japanese couldn't suppress the agony of death by fire and suffocation. but they were no more likely to surrender to us than we would have been to them had we ever been confronted with the possibility of surrender. In fighting the Japanese, surrender was not one of our options. Amid our shouts of appreciation, Womack and his buddy started back to battalion headquarters to await the summons to break another deadlock somewhere on the battlefield, or lose their lives trying. The job of flamethrower gunner was probably the least desirable of any open to a Marine infantryman. Carrying tanks with about 70 pounds of flammable jellied gasoline through enemy fire over rugged terrain in hot weather to squirt flames into the mouth of a cave or pillbox was an assignment that few survived, but all carried out with magnificent courage. We left the craters and approached the pillbox cautiously. Bergin ordered some of the men to cover it, while the rest of us looked over the fallen Japanese to be sure none was still alive. Wounded Japanese invariably exploded grenades when approached, if possible, killing their enemies along with themselves. All of them were dead. The pillbox was out of action thanks to the flamethrower and the Amtrak. There were 7 enemy dead inside and 10 outside. Our packs and mortars were only slightly damaged by the fire from the Amtrak's 75mm gun. Of the 12 Marine mortarmen, our only casualties were Redifer and Leslie Porter, who had taken some grenade fragments. They weren't hurt seriously. Our luck in the whole affair had been incredible. If the enemy had surprised us and rushed us, we might have been in a bad fix. During this lull, the men stripped the packs and pockets of the enemy dead for souvenirs. This was a gruesome business, but Marines executed it in a most methodical manner. Helmet headbands were checked for flags, packs and pockets were emptied, and gold teeth were extracted. Sabres, pistols, and harikari knives were highly prized and carefully cared for until they could be sent to the folks back home or sold to some pilot or sailor for a fat price. Rifles and other larger weapons usually were rendered useless and thrown aside. They were too heavy to carry in addition to our own equipment. They would be picked up later as fine souvenirs by the rear echelon troops. The men in the rifle companies had a lot of fun joking about the hair-raising stories these people, who had never seen a live Japanese or been shot at, would probably tell after the war. The men gloated over, compared, and often swapped their prizes. It was a brutal, ghastly ritual the likes of which have occurred since ancient times on battlefields, where the antagonists have possessed a profound mutual hatred. It was uncivilized, as is all war, and was carried out with that particular savagery that characterized the struggle between the Marines and the Japanese. It wasn't simply souvenir hunting or looting the enemy dead. It was more like Indian warriors taking scalps. While I was removing a bayonet and scabbard from a dead Japanese, I noticed a Marine near me. He wasn't in our mortar section, but had happened by and wanted to get in on the spoils. He came up to me dragging what I assumed to be a corpse. But the Japanese weren't dead. He had been wounded severely in the back and couldn't move his arms. Otherwise he would have resisted to his last breath. The Japanese's mouth glowed with huge gold-crowned teeth, and his captor wanted them. He put the point of his kabar on the base of a tooth and hit the handle with the palm of his hand. Because the Japanese was kicking his feet and thrashing about, the knife point glanced off the tooth and sank deeply into the victim's mouth. The Marine cursed him, and with a slash cut his cheeks open to each ear. He put his foot on the sufferer's lower jaw and tried again. Blood poured out of the soldier's mouth. He made a gurgling noise and thrashed wildly. I shouted, "Put the man out of his misery!" All I got for an answer was cussing out. Another Marine ran up, put a bullet in the enemy soldier's brain, and ended his agony. The scavenger grumbled and continued extracting his prizes undisturbed. Such was the incredible cruelty that decent men could commit when reduced to a brutish existence in their fight for survival amid the violent death, terror, tension, fatigue, and filth that was the infantryman's war. Our code of conduct toward the enemy differed drastically from that prevailing back at the division CP. The struggle for survival went on day after weary day, night after terrifying night. One remembers vividly the landings and the beachheads and the details of the first 2 or 3 days and nights of a campaign. After that, time lost all meaning. A lull of hours or days seemed but a fleeting instant of heaven-sent tranquility. lying in a foxhole, sweating out an enemy artillery or mortar barrage, or waiting to dash across open ground under machine gun or artillery fire, defied any concept of time. To the non-combatants and those on the periphery of action, the war meant only boredom or occasional excitement. But to those who entered the meat grinder itself, the war was a netherworld of horror from which escape seemed less and less likely as casualties mounted and the fighting dragged on and on. Time had no meaning. Life had no meaning. The fierce struggle for survival in the abyss of Peleliu eroded the veneer of civilization and made savages of us all. We existed in an environment totally incomprehensible to men behind the lines, service troops and civilians. A trip inside the pillbox by Redifer and Bergin solved the mystery of how some of the occupants had survived the grenades and shell bursts. Bergin shot a soldier inside who was feigning death. Concrete walls partitioned the bunker into compartments connected by small openings. 3 or 4 enemy soldiers occupied each compartment, which had its own firing ports to the outside. Each would have had to be put out of action individually had we not had the help of Womack and his flamethrower. When our gunny came by and saw the results of our encounter with the pillbox he had thought was empty, he looked sheepish. He gazed in amazement at the enemy dead scattered around. We really razzed him about it, or rather we gave him the nearest thing approaching the razz that we Marine privates dared hand out to the austere personage of GY. Sergeant Saunders. I have thought often that Bergin should have been decorated for the fine leadership he exhibited in coordinating and directing the knockout of the pillbox. I'm sure men have been decorated for less. We set up our 2 mortars in a large crater near the now knocked-out pillbox and registered in the guns for the night. The ammo carriers dug into the softer coral around the edge of the crater. An Amtrak brought up rations and a unit of fire for the company. The wind began to blow briskly, and it got cloudy and heavily overcast. As darkness settled, heavy clouds scudded across the sky. The scene reminded me of hurricane weather on the Gulf Coast back home. Not far behind us, the heat of the fire burning in the pillbox exploded Japanese grenades and small arms ammunition. All night, occasional shifts of wind blew the nauseating smell of burning flesh our way. The rain fell in torrents and the wind blew hard. Ships fired star shells to illuminate the battlefield for our battalion. But as soon as the parachute of a star shell opened, the wind swept it swiftly along like some invisible hand snatching away a candle. In the few hundred yards they still held at the northern end of the island, the enemy was fairly quiet. The next morning, again with the help of tanks and Amtraks, our battalion took most of the remainder of Nyesibus. Our casualties were remarkably low for the number of Japanese we killed. In mid-afternoon we learned that an army unit would relieve us shortly and complete the job on the northern end of Ngesibus. Our mortar section halted to await orders and dispersed among some open bushes. In our midst was the wreckage of a Japanese heavy machine gun and the remains of the squad that had been wiped out by Company K. The squad members had been killed in the exact positions to be occupied by such a squad, according to the book. At first glance, the dead gunner appeared about to fire his deadly weapon. He still sat bolt upright in the proper firing position behind the breech of his machine gun. Even in death, his eyes stared widely along the gun sights. Despite the vacant look of his dilated pupils, I couldn't believe he was dead. Cold chills ran along my spine. Gooseflesh tickled my back. It seemed as though he was looking through me into all eternity, that at any instant he would raise his hands, which rested in a relaxed manner on his thighs, grip the handles on the breech and press the thumb trigger. The bright, shiny brass slugs in the strip clip appeared as ready as the gunner, anxious to speed out, to kill and to maim more of the American devils. But he would rot and they would corrode. Neither he nor his ammo could do any more for the Emperor. The crown of the gunner's skull had been blasted off, probably by one of our automatic weapons. His riddled steel helmet lay on the deck like a punctured tin can. The assistant gunner lay beside the gun. Apparently, he had just opened a small green wooden chest filled with strip clips of machine gun cartridges when he was killed. Several other Japanese soldiers, ammo carriers, lay strung out at intervals behind the gun. A Company K rifleman who had been in the fight that knocked out the machine gun crew sat on his helmet nearby and told us the story. The action had taken place the day before, while the mortar section was fighting at the pillbox. The rifleman said, "The thing that I just couldn't believe was the way those nip ammo carriers could chop around here on the double with those heavy boxes of ammo on their backs." Each ammo box had 2 leather straps, and each ammo carrier had a heavy box on his back with the straps around his shoulders. I lifted one of the ammo chests. It weighed more than our mortar. What the Japanese lacked in height, they certainly compensated for in muscle. "I'd sure hate to have to lug that thing around, wouldn't you?" asked the Marine. "When they got hit," he continued, "they fell to the deck like a brick because of all that weight." As we talked, I noticed a fellow mortarman sitting next to me. He held a handful of coral pebbles in his left hand. With his right hand, he idly tossed them into the open skull of the Japanese machine gunner. Each time his pitch was true, I heard a little splash of rainwater in the ghastly receptacle. My buddy tossed the coral chunks as casually as a boy casting pebbles into a puddle on some muddy road back home. There was nothing malicious in his action. The war had so brutalized us that it was beyond belief. I noticed gold teeth glistening brightly between the lips of several of the dead Japanese lying around us. Harvesting gold teeth was one facet of stripping enemy dead that I hadn't practiced so far. But stopping beside a corpse with a particularly tempting number of shining crowns, I took out my kabar and bent over to make the extractions. A hand grasped me by the shoulder, and I straightened up to see who it was. "What are you going to do, Sledgehammer?" asked Doc Caswell. His expression was a mix of sadness and reproach as he looked intently at me. "Just thought I'd collect some gold teeth," I replied. "Don't do it." "Why not, Doc?" "You don't want to do that sort of thing. What would your folks think if they knew?" "Well, my dad's a doctor, and I bet he'd think it was kinda interesting," I replied, bending down to resume my task. "No! The germs, Sledgehammer. You might get germs from them." I stopped and looked inquiringly at Doc and said, "Germs? Gosh, I never thought of that." "Yeah, you got to be careful about germs around all these dead nips, you know," he said vehemently. "Well then, I guess I'd better just cut off the insignia on his collar and leave his nasty teeth alone. You think that's safe, Doc?" "I guess so," he replied with an approving nod. Reflecting on the episode after the war, I realized that Doc Caswell didn't really have germs in mind. He was a good friend and a fine, genuine person whose sensitivity hadn't been crushed out by the war. He was merely trying to help me retain some of mine and not become completely callous and harsh.